Hi, this is our fifth lecture, and it is all about linear models. And linear models here are more about separation of your data, linear separability. Okay, so today, or in this lecture, we will cover linear decision boundaries. Talk about one of the earliest, and if not the earliest, learning algorithm for linear decision boundary, and then which is called perceptron, and then we'll talk about perceptron extensions. Mostly this will be about separable case as linear perceptron. Initially the algorithm was developed for separable cases when the data can be separated, the classes and the data can be separated by a line, or rather a hyperplane, which we will talk about shortly. And then we will also talk about non-separable case. So, linear decision boundary. Well, you have watched all of the lectures on linear algebra, and you're perfectly comfortable, I think, should be by now familiar with the line equation. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So the one that we usually have in mind for a line is the slope plus bias expression of a line, right, in 2D. So let's slightly modify it. So we have two dimensions, x0 and x1, and we have our bias and we have our slope. So slope encodes angle, with a positive slope and a negative slope, and bias denotes that shift from the origin, just the distance of the whole line from a line parallel to it that comes through the origin. Long familiar and kind of boring equation. How do we extend it? How do we generalize it to multiple dimensions? What this equation represents is a two-dimensional line, and what we can do with it, yes, in 2D, if we have two classes, green and red, then okay, let's remove that. We don't need this actually, but okay. So in 2D, this line would separate red from green. If we rearrange this equation and write it in the following simple way, let's say we have kx0 minus 1x1 plus b equals 0. So now if we split those coefficients and arrange them in a vector k minus 1 and b, and represent our x, our parameter space, as x0, x1, and 1, then let's call this w, and and let's call this x. Only w and x are vectors now. When we do that, we see that we can write our near and dear familiar line equation as a vector product or a scalar product of w and x. X is something that is changing, so x0, x1, those coefficients are changing around, and w is something that is fixed, that describes a line. When the scalar product equals 0, then that means a point is on the line. And if we plot w for this, well, actually, if we're talking about the minus k, we should have a minus here, right? If we plot the w, it'll be a vector that's perpendicular to the line, and w is called a normal vector, normal to the hyperplane. Now our hyperplane is one-dimensional. And the trick with the bias we've done, that's an important trick. Before we generalize, I want to draw you a figure. So notice what we did. We added a 1 to any possible x coordinate. Let's go to the blackboard. What we effectively have done, so we started with a flat space, and in that flat space we had some green data points and some red data points. But if we draw a line that is easy to manipulate in this two-dimensional space using two-dimensional x0, x1 coordinates, and I'm going deliberately slow. I don't want to quickly accelerate and lose you. So those of you who perfectly know what I'm talking about, you can skip this or listen to the video at 2x speed. So if we do this, if the dimension of w of the vector, I'll delete this part. So if we do this, if we have a normal, as we know how vector is defined, if we have a normal vector and we move this, let me see, yeah, if we move this purple point around, when we do so, we rotate our hyperplane from one position to another. But if we do so and try to separate green from red here on this picture, then we will not be able to, or will not always able to, because we do need an ability to shift our origin of or a pivot point of rotation of this normal to the hyperplane. So just working with this red w and x and having that equation means that our hyperplane, or a line in this case, in 2D case, will have to always pass through the origin, and all we can do by rotating w around, but as you notice, scaling w back and forth wouldn't change the line direction. But by rotating W around, we can orient the separating line, but we cannot separate all of the classes. What if our actual separating line is here, because red goes as much as up to here, while green is over there, right? So we can never align the white line here, separating hyperplane, with the red separating hyperplane in this case, in the two-dimensional case, because all we can do is rotate the white line. Importantly, again, and I repeat, any point on this line, as we know, scalar product or inner product of two vectors, when it's 0, that means they're perpendicular. So any vector x, which denotes a coordinate in the 2D system, that is perpendicular to our predefined or normal vector to our hyperplane, that is means it lies on the hyperplane. So how can we deal with this situation when we have a W and can conveniently rotate it, and we have such a cool, clear equation? Yeah, of course, we can do the ugly add the bias, but it will be kind of weird when we go to higher dimensions, where we have three-dimensional data and rotate the space, rotate the hyperplane, the separating hyperplane, and then adding some scalar value. The equation doesn't look as beautiful as it could. So what we do, and we'll use that multiple times, some of the algorithms that we will consider will switch back and forth from using the bias, from not using the bias. But look at an interesting trick, a transformation. Add another coordinate to each of the points here. By adding another coordinates, we go in pseudo 3D. It's kind of a fake 3D. We take this square napkin and we put it in 3D. Imagine that this is one that we added to each of those points. So now each of them just looks like x0, x1, and 1. That's why it's nothing but this hyperplane that x0, x1, and x2. So this hyperplane is just a parallel hyperplane to x0 and x1. We lifted the hyperplane, and that's the beauty of what we're gonna do. Our W vector now represents a hyperplane, now two-dimensional generalization of a line hyperplane, that passes through the origin. And it passes through the origin, but what we consider as a separating line, where is it? If we'll look at this, we are using the yellow hyperplane. It kind of continues And okay, so look how clean and convenient. Now our dimension of w and x can be anything, and the hyperplane equation will still be like the circled one. And I can sort of I don't know, I can just grab with my hand, right, this vector and drag it around. And when I drag it around, I will create another hyperplane that passes through the origin and, I don't know, points here. And now my separating, well, not anymore separating, but my separating hyperplane, let's make it orange, is here. Or it's still in effect a line, because as I said, because of this one added, we're still in a pseudo 3D or pseudo ND space. We just added another convenience. And back to our hyperplane equation. So this equation that I wrote here for multiple dimensions could be represented as this figure. And this figure is just a coefficient. Well, it's the way it's drawn here, it's kind of upside down. R1 is added on top, but it doesn't matter. It could be on top, on the bottom, or effectively anywhere, as long as it's consistent for all x's, for all data points. And our bias is now encoded in our data points. And when our w normal vector is normalized to 1, the bias is just that weight. Let's look at the equation of the hyperplane again. Since I think these simple geometrical intuitions are super important for understanding what's going on with linear classifiers, and to understand further as an effect of as an effect to understand the geometry of this whole classification space. Let's dwell on this a little bit more, a little bit longer. Slightly different notation from what I proposed in the previous slide, but I figure let's say x0, x1, x2, right? So distance from the origin is our bias weight normalized by the length of the w vector. Usually the normal vector is set in geometry, at least in analytical geometry, and again, just for your reference, is set to 1, so w0 is the bias in the distance simultaneously. When we're gonna do optimization, w is actually our parameter. So what does it mean to grab and rotate? It means to modify and to tweak, to change the parameters. Remember I told last time that x is our data and x's don't change. They're right. Well, we can of course scale them and filter them and all that, but assuming it's our data, they're fixed, and we just want to find the right w. So in the course of changing and searching for right W, we can of course restrict it to a sphere, and sphere of radius 1. This is a baby sphere, a circle, and this is my W, and I can just restrict it to the circle of radius 1. But that adds additional complexities to the algorithm, so we don't do that, or won't do that in this lecture today. And W could be anything, and then as an effect we do need to normalize to get our distance from the origin. Another geometric notion is this distance of a given point to its projection on our hyperplane, and you can derive it yourself, but it's basically g of x. As you know, it's 0 only for points that are exactly on the hyperplane, and so it will not be 0. And again, if W, those are all vectors, three-dimensional in this case, but multi-dimensional in the general case. So R is the distance, how far is a point from our separating hyperplane. Okay, just kind of recap of the previous slide of the same thing. Yeah, so another thing that we could see from here, that, well, like, we can just rewrite this using W transpose X. So in case of normalized W, conveniently, if this is 1, our equation just exactly gives us a line equation, gives us a distance from a point from the hyperplane. But notice another interesting and super useful property that we're going to use. If you have W that defines this line here, so this W, this hyperplane, again, my baby hyperplane, the model. If our X, imagine this is a length 1, the W has length 1, so we are in right here. R, the distance of a point from a hyperplane, equals W transpose X, inner product of projection. What happens to those two different vectors that are not on the hyperplane, or 2 points equivalently? So point 1 and point 2, and I'm inconsistent, of course. It should be point 0, right? Zero-based counting. When we take inner product, this projection, now just a little clearer why this is the distance, because the W transpose W is length 1. When we take projection of sort of collocated vectors, or of a vector that is on the same side of the hyperplane where W is pointing to, our result will be positive. But for a vector that's on the other side, the result will be negative, because the projection is right here in the opposite direction. They're pointing, this vector is pointing sort of to the opposite direction of the W relative to the separating hyperplane. And we, thus conveniently, with this representation and this calculation of the distance, we conveniently get a negative space in a positive space. So any point that's on one side of the hyperplane, it's kind of arbitrary. We can flip W and the signs will flip, but given W that defines the hyperplane, that W also defines a half space. So this half space will be positive, and this half space will be negative, and everything on the hyperplane, as you know, is 0. So in 3 dimensions, it's the same. This half space will be positive here, and this will be negative. And going higher dimensions, we will get to just by analogy the same situation even in the higher dimension. Okay, that was tedious, but enough. So an example, everyone loves examples. So this is a super familiar example. Linearly separable, as you see, data set, well, at least the one I'm showing you is linearly separable. This data set is a very famous data set. It's iris flower data set, or Fisher's iris data set. It's a multivariate data set introduced by the British statistician, eugenist and biologist Ronald Fisher, who actually revolutionized the study of statistics. This dataset was introduced in his 1936 paper. And so the use of multiple measurements in taxonomic problems as an example of linear discriminant analysis. That's the paper title. It's sometimes called Anderson's iris dataset because Edgar Anderson collected the data to quantify the morphologic variation of iris flowers of 3 dataset species. 2 of the 3 species were collected in the Gaspe Peninsula, all from the same pasture and picked on the same day and measured at the same time by the same person with the same apparatus. Fisher's paper was published in the journal The Annals of Eugenics, creating controversy about the continued use of the iris dataset for teaching statistical techniques today. The dataset consists of 50 samples from each of 3 species of iris: Iris setosa, Iris virginica, and Iris versicolor. 4 features were measured from each sample: the length and the width of the sepals and petals in centimeters. That's what you see here on this picture. And based on the combination of these 4 features, Fisher developed a linear discriminant model to distinguish the species from each other. So we do have data that comes in multidimensional space, or most of that data comes in multidimensional space if we measure our subjects or our samples as a collection of various measurements. For humans, we have weight, height, age, eye color, whatnot, hair length. We can do multiple measurements. For human faces, for recognition, we can have multiple measurements. So those dimensions, those x0, x1 that we drew, that just abstractly and geometrically, they're not too abstract. They're actually, you need to train yourself to think in those linear algebra spaces and vector spaces. Okay. An interesting example also is that, and again, this some clash of notation. Y's and A's. Our Y is an X. And our A is our W. So yes, it is terminology, introducing some terminology, because I want you to change your thinking about these problems if this terminology is not already innate to your thinking, or just remind you what it is. So this separating hyperplane would separate those two classes, the black and the red, but only if our W vector, our normal vector to the separating hyperplane, is within that solution region. So that's good. And another thing, we can use labels -1 and 1 for the classes, and then we won't need to worry about the sign, because if we say that this is the label -1 and this label is 1, and all we will need to do is W transpose X times the label, right? And if this times the label is greater than 0, then classification is correct. By doing that, we're effectively, well, why it is correct? Say label equals -1 for this particular X, and classification is correct. That means W times X is negative, is less than 0, right? So if this is negative times negative label, W times X times label, let's make it specific, is positive. But the same is true for a positive label, W times X. For correct classification, should be greater than 0, but that means that LW transpose X should be greater than 0. So if we make labels negative and positives and multiply our classification by those labels, we know that positive result means correct classification, and negative result, for example, if classified incorrectly, here, I will keep this on, classified incorrectly here would mean positive times negative, and a negative sample, negative class sample, is incorrectly classified, and our result is less than 0. So geometry is helping a lot here. Another example is a different data set. So there is a linearly separable data set, and this data set is not linearly separable. So we cannot draw a line anywhere such that both blue and red, the pluses and minuses, are separated on the other side into different half planes, half spaces, as it is done here in linearly separable case. This is another non-linearly separable case. But of course, some people say, oh, this is non-linearly separable case because we can draw a border and everything inside is plus, everything outside is minus. But then I can say, well, anything is non-linearly separable, right? We can always find an intricate border that separates plus class from a minus class. Well, those are two major cases and a minor subcase.